Hey guys, and welcome back to QualityShot Tennis. And I'm really excited to be joined by Brian and Josh from Tennis IQ Podcast. And we're going to be talking about, you guessed it, sports psychology in tennis. And I can't wait to get into it. Before I do though, Brian, how are you doing? And Josh as well.
Doing great, Faizan. Thanks for having us on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Really excited to talk with you.
Yeah, I appreciate you guys taking time out of your day to discuss. We can start off with sports psychology in tennis, and we were talking on camera just a second ago about how nowadays it's so much more normal to have, for example, psychologists in tennis teams in not just elite level, but now everyone's thinking about how can I get that extra edge, that mental edge to give me that extra boost against certain players. For me, when I look at a lot of the top players in top 50, top 100, ability-wise, there's quite a few players that probably have similar ability, but what really sets apart those elite players is that mental side of things. And we're really looking more into data and analytics, and people are being more innovative in the sport of tennis. So from your guys' points of view, because I know you would have been looking into that quite in depth, how much of a change have you seen in the last, say, 5-10 years?
I think we've seen quite a change. I've been doing this type of work for about 12, 13 years, and a lot has changed in that time, where even across all sports, it's just becoming more and more mainstream. I wouldn't say it's mainstream yet, but it's becoming that way. And I think in tennis perhaps has lagged behind some other sports. If I think of like golf, mental coaches and sports psychologists have been more present in golf for a longer period of time. And the relationship with those professionals has been more open. I think that's one thing we're seeing now, Faizan, is that the relationship with that aspect of your performance is becoming more open. And certainly Iga Swiatek and Daria Abramovic are, maybe at the forefront of that. Everybody knows who she is and what they're doing. So I think it's great to see that because, as you alluded to, many of the players are technically, physically very similar. But what's going to separate them? When we often talk about the mental game being 90% of performance, so it makes sense to bring more formal training to that very large variable.
Yeah. What do you think, Josh? Sorry, I know you're about to speak as well.
Yeah, no, I would definitely echo a lot of what Brian said. I think, in the past, there's definitely more of a stigma around psychology and mental training and sports psychology. So I think, having a number of top professional athletes speaking out about mental health and mental performance. And, Brian mentioned Iga Swiatek, but, a number of pro players now are very open about their use of a sports psychology professional and, travel with them full time or, consult with them for part of the year. So I think it really has changed. I mean, even we saw, Ons Jabeur and many of the top male players. I remember when Daniil Medvedev made the U.S. Open finals for the first time, I think 2019, and he had a sports psychology professional with him in his box. And, we just saw the rise that he had made over those months before. But I think the stigma has really shifted, and now people are starting to get to the point where they're thinking, if I'm not training the mental game, I'm falling behind everyone else.
Yeah, it's definitely true about the stigma shifting, isn't it? Because in the past, I feel in the 90s or even the 2000s as well, and before then, there were some players that you probably would have thought, looking back on it now, they probably were struggling mentally with the tour and in certain instances, but they were more portrayed as being difficult and, they don't really... They're not being professional. Nowadays, people are more open to actually come out and talk about it. And we've seen a lot of players come out and speak openly about, how they're feeling from the mental side of things. And we've seen like Osaka's come out and talked about it in depth. And we've seen, someone like Dominic Thiem was talking about the bubbles when there were no crowds. And he said he really struggled with that as two examples. So I think it's great to see an acceptance and also a realization from players that, and not just players, but everyone else in the tennis world, that this is something that we should be aware of and not just ignore, because as you said, Brian, and I was going to ask actually, 90% of it is the mental side, as you were saying, and I agree with you, because that's a question I love to ask a lot of the players when I interview them is, how much of it is the mental side, and they do say it's around that 90% mark, which is, as you say, is an incredible number if you think about it, to not actually then work on as much as, say, the physical side or the conditioning side or anything else, or the technical side, right? A lot of people would have completely ignored that side of the game. So it's great to see now that people are trying to work on it. And there's all these different apps, and I'm sure you guys know more than me, all the tons of different apps, and of course professionals like yourselves who can help and actually give people a better edge and a better understanding of where they're out there. So I guess it leads me quite nicely, because we were talking about the elite players, the players that have that mental edge, and of course 3 players that have had the mental edge for quite a long time, and one of them now retired is the big 3. So we can talk about Roger Federer first, because he's just retired, but the reason why I wanted to go over those is not because they're the most well-known, but also because I was really interested to get your guys' opinion on how mentally they may have had to have, or the mentality they would have had to have got where they've got, because all 3 players have had different challenges or different, I guess, hurdles to overcome to get to that stage, despite them now being at very similar levels of greatness, if you know what I mean. But they've got there in very different ways. With Federer, he was the guy who started it all off, right? He had Sampras on 14 slams, so that was the first goal. Okay, for him, as soon as he started winning slams and dominating, it was, let's get to 14. But then it was, okay, after he got past 14, I'm really interested to know from you guys as well, not just how he got there, but then when he got past there, what was the motivation? What really motivated him? After he got to 15, he could have just thought, I'm done. 15, I'm in front. No one thought Sampras was going to get 14, then no one thought anyone was going to get past Sampras. He probably was thinking, maybe he wasn't, but he could have thought, no one's going to get past 15. I can just pack it in, or, I don't need to worry about it too much, and have that mental drop, or just kind of being happy with where he was. Instead, he continued to strive to succeed and have that drive and determination from the mental side of things to say, actually, no, I want to win as many as possible and get as big a lead as possible. And I don't want to stop just here. And I think that's a lot harder potentially when we talk about Nadal Djokovic being the chasers almost, because they have that to chase. But for Federer, it was interesting to understand how he had that motivation to continue to go. And I wanted to get your guys' thoughts on that as well. What your thoughts are on how he managed to get beyond that, and what he might have been thinking from maybe inside his psyche.
I mean, I think, I think part of it had to have come from just the dominance that he really had for that period of time. I mean, I don't think maybe it's arguable, but his dominance from, let's say, 2003 to 2007, 2008, on, at least two of the three surfaces, on hard court and grass court, he was by far and away the best player in the world. And of course, on clay, Nadal just extremely dominant, starting a couple of years later, starting around 2005 or so. But just how many slams he won during that time, how far he really was from the rest of the pack, I think let him feel that, this is possible. It is possible to surpass the greats. It is possible to surpass Sampras's record. And, I think when he started getting some more resistance in terms of, Nadal starting on clay and then, beating him at Wimbledon and turning that, winning more against him in terms of their head-to-head, and then Djokovic, starting, let's say 2011 to really be, up there with the top players, at the top of the rankings, really often. I think he sort of viewed that as more competition, but it seemed to fuel him and drive him at that point to, to know that maybe 15 wouldn't be enough, because he had the lead by a good bit at that point, Nadal and Djokovic, were at his heels.
If I think of Federer's journey, probably, pre him dominating the game, we know him as a younger player who had some issues with temper and so forth. And that was really blocking his best tennis. If we think of it, Timothy Galway, the the author of The Inner Game of Tennis, has this performance equation, which he says actual performance equals your potential minus interference. And really, Roger's game at that point, his ability to deal with mistakes, was a big source of interference and not allowing him to actually reach that. And once he dealt with that, then his game really stepped up. That's when he really became that great player. His confidence went really high. He was just totally dominating. So when I think of Roger, I think of that piece of the journey. I think of someone who's extremely confident, has a lot of clarity in how he plays the game. He doesn't go out there and adjust his game really to who he's playing. He plays his way. He imposes his game on you. And I think that's really a lesson for a lot of players, especially younger players, is you've got to figure out what your own game is and try to impose that on other people. Yes, you may have to make some adjustments, right? But that's one beautiful thing about him. When it comes to, winning Grand Slams and why'd you go past 15, I'm not even sure. And I think Nadal has actually talked about this. It's not so much about the winning. It's that intrinsic, deep internal motivation that they simply love to play tennis and they want to keep becoming the best that they can be. And where they are, that just involves winning a lot of tournaments. Of course, you're going to want to play those big majors and it's important to you, and you're going to design your schedule around peaking at those events. But I think it's not so much necessarily I've got to win X number of majors. I think it's just like, I love playing tennis. I'm going to keep playing to the best of my ability as long as I can. So I think that's actually a really good example of how one should do goal setting. Goal setting shouldn't necessarily be about winning titles. It should be about becoming the best you can become. And those titles are really more milestones on that path. And I think we've talked about this on our podcast, with respect to Dominic Thiem, who has certainly struggled a bit with motivation post his US Open win. And that might be an example of not great goal setting, where his goal really had been to win a Grand Slam title, a major title. And he did it. And so, okay, now I've done it. What do I do next? So to me, I think that's one thing that's common with Federer, Nadal, and Djokovic, is that deep intrinsic motivation that just drives them to be better and better all the time.
Well, that's really interesting. Yeah, well, that's a good way of putting it, I guess, is deep-rooted want to, as you say, just be better and be the best they can be. And then that, as you said, in turn leads to success, because that's how good they are. They are generational talents, and they are three of the greatest players to ever play the game. And also your point about Roger Federer not adjusting his game and imposing his will on other opponents is definitely true, because I talked to Noah Rubin, who had played Roger Federer in that 2017 Australian Open in the second round, and he said to me that exactly that. He said he doesn't change the way he plays, because he wasn't playing his best tennis that day. He was shanking the ball a few times, but he said, what I noticed is he didn't stray from his tactics. He said, this is the way I'm going to play. Doesn't matter if I shank a few balls or it doesn't go exactly how I want it to go. I'm going to continue, because I believe in the process of how I play. I believe in the method of how I play. And if it doesn't give me success, then fine. But at least I'm happy that I'm happy to say that I've committed to how I want to play. And that's exactly what he said to me. And he said he took time away so well with the way that he steps in and takes the ball early, and he found it really difficult because he thinks of himself as someone who's able to get to balls, a lot. But he ended up watching the highlights and after the full match and said that he looked slow compared to how he normally looked, and he wasn't happy with that. But that was really interesting what he was saying. But do you guys think? Then I've got two questions on what you've both said. The first one is, given that I think Josh is more to you about. You said that with Djokovic and Nadal, they maybe gave him motivation to continue going, because he thought, maybe they might catch me on my heels if I just say I'm happy now. So do you think then, if they weren't around, then he wouldn't have won as many slams? Do you think it would have, say, for example, might have finished on 15 or 16 and said, okay, and then the motivation would have dropped potentially from the mental side of things?
It's tough to know. I mean, it's tough to know if in a world without a Nadal and a Djokovic, were some of maybe those next level players, would they have had more opportunities and, won their first slam? And then would that have given them more confidence in the rest of their journey? Someone like a Berdych, for instance, who, reached finals and but never could get or reach Wimbledon, never could get over that hump in terms of winning a slam. So if there was no Djokovic and Nadal and Federer was the only player at the top, would someone like that have had more success? It's tough to know, but I do think that those rivalries did probably help all three of them to continue to push them. And and I think we see it in other sports where a player maybe wins a gold medal for the first time, or they win that championship for the first time, and then there's that fall off, because it's like it's almost tough to figure out what's next and tough to stay motivated, or maybe there's that drop. So I think having the three of them around and continuing to push each other, and the fact that each of them really excelled at different parts of the game and excelled at different times, but continued to help each of them along their journeys.
Yeah, I'd agree with Josh. I think it's hard to know, because is it possible that without those two guys, Federer becomes bored at some point? Because if you think about like 2006, Federer's record, I believe, was something like 92-5. 4 of those losses were to Nadal, so almost unbeatable against the rest of the tour. How long can you sustain that if you keep having years like that? We can't be remiss and not mention Andy Murray and Juan Martín del Potro. They were also pretty good players, but just they've had injuries and that haven't let them to be consistent challengers to it. But so I think it's interesting to speculate on that. Now, one player we know has benefited from it because he said it was Novak Djokovic. He, in one of his finals at the Australian Open, he actually openly thanked Federer and Nadal for their presence on the tour because they pushed him to become better. They set a bar that he knew he wanted to reach. And again, that's an interesting way for a player to look at that, not as like they're my competition. No, actually they're setting the level for me. So I agree with Josh in that, the other guys, they have provided foils for each other, and that's important. They probably, without each other, they're not the same. They've needed that, people to push them a little bit further. And so I think they've all benefited from that.
Yeah, I agree. I guess in tennis as well, you always see rivalries, right, with the greatest, and they've always had at least one other player to bounce off to then help themselves elevate in their status. But you were talking about a bit earlier. You're talking about Brian Federer and the fact that he had a really bad temper as a young child, and I read one of his biographies, and it's a really interesting story. Well, part of his story, I guess, is the fact that he got over that and had to work with a sports psychologist, and now is so calm, or has been so calm for so many years in his career since. But used to break rackets, had massive tantrums, and was completely like unprofessional, you could say, at that point, which is as a very, very young tennis player. But the transformation was complete, and as soon as it was, then, as you say, his game elevated. But one player, and I'm probably a can of worms, I'm sure I want to talk about, is Nick Kyrgios, right? So Nick Kyrgios seems to potentially play better. Does he play better? I'll ask you guys in a second. Does he play better because he's able to have those tantrums and it's an outlet to his box to potentially shout to his box, to break his rackets, to get it out there almost as a release, and then he's able to play his better tennis? Or is it a case of, say, this year he's had a very good year this year so far? Is it more when he plays really good tennis, it's in spite of that, or is it actually that's part of his psyche and that he almost needs that to be able to perform? I'm interested to get your guys' thoughts on that.
That's it's tough. We don't know Nick. We've certainly talked about him. I think anytime you engage with some of those emotions, you can channel it into some good stuff at times. But if you engage too much with it, then it can become a distraction. And I think that's sometimes what we see with Nick. I think it's also interesting when he at times he'll get a lead, and that's when he starts to go to some of those behaviors where he's talking to his box, and it seems to become almost self-limiting. So it would be interesting to talk to Nick about, why does your attention go to that? Is it a way to distract you from the pressure? Maybe it is, right? I don't know. Sometimes it seems to work out. Sometimes it doesn't. And so, attention and focus are certainly really important aspects of top performance. Nick's got a lot of skill in the sport. He's got an unbelievable serve. His backhand's amazing. His great touch, really hard to read his game. And so what I do like about Nick is it feels like he's getting a little bit more serious with each year, certainly this year. If he can just continue on that path, Faizan, like he doesn't have to go from 0 to 100. Just like, let's get a little bit better each year and see how he does with some of these, these things that we see that look potentially self-limiting, although we don't exactly know why. If he can keep getting better and better, it'd be very interesting to see what he does in some of these tournaments, right? I mean, great Wimbledon. Once he became the favorite at the U.S. Open, things seemed to fall apart a little bit, but sometimes you need to have that experience in order to really learn from it. And I think that if Nick can look at things like that, like I'm having these experiences, and maybe I needed to have that experience in order to learn from it. All right, how can I be better the next time I'm in that situation?
Yeah, no, I agree. Josh, what are you on the same page on that?
I think so. Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to Nick, and he's definitely had a lot of breakthroughs, this past year, whether it be the Wimbledon final or getting to the quarters at the U.S. Open, being the favorite, losing in a tight 5-setter to Kachanov. But I think when it comes to his mental game and his anger, right? If we want to pinpoint that part of it, it's tough. I mean, as Brian said, anger there is the ability where that could help somebody. And I think there are instances with McEnroe where it did. I think for the vast majority of players, it limits and holds them back. And I would put Nick into that category. The one thing I think it can do, and I think we saw this in particular at Wimbledon against Tsitsipas, is some of his antics, some of his chirping can actually be a big distraction for the other player. And if the other player is not ready, which I would say Tsitsipas wasn't on that particular day, that combination of the distraction of his antics and his overwhelming ability, especially when he's playing well, between his serve, which is up there with the best in the world, and I mean, he doesn't have a lot of holes in his game other than the mental game. So when he's on and when his opponent is flustered, good luck. It's going to be tough. But I think for him, I don't think it helps him. In fact, I think there's a lot of instances where he throws away a lot of points or he plays a sloppy service game because he's chirping and because he's annoyed and frustrated about something. And I think what we mentioned the big three, and I think what makes them so good and has made them so good for decades at this point is their consistency, is their reliability, is the fact that they're not throwing away points in games. And at the highest level, at the top of the game, there's such small margins and everyone has the ability. So if you play a loose service game here and you're go for an unnecessary tweener at a moment where you don't really need to, and it's just a sloppy unforced error, it doesn't take a lot to make the difference between some of these guys. It really doesn't. So I think as much as he has gotten better, that those types of things, that decision making, that emotional control, some of those sorts of things still hold him back from being, a top 5 player, let's just say, and grinding week in, week out and winning, 250s, 500s, Masters, the ways that these other guys do, because they're just more reliable and dependable at this point.
Yeah, no, I agreed with both of you, and I'm sure the Kyrgios Tsitsipas drama will make good viewing for the Netflix documentary they're doing. Anyways, I'm sure they're really happy with that. But yeah, agreed. I think with Kyrgios, it's good to see him finally come out and say, I want to win a Grand Slam. Before it was, I want to entertain the crowd. I don't care if I win or lose. It's just about having fun, which is fine. But, and as Brian said, I guess Federer and Nadal have come out and said they want to enjoy it. But part of them enjoying it, I feel, is success as well, right? Because they want to play to the best of their potential. It's not just going out there and just playing for the sake of it, which I feel like at times he was. But now, he said he's training hard, he's sleeping right. There's stories of him, going to the pub late at night, but now he says, gets into bed early. It's funny because in all of his interviews recently, you can tell that he's dialed in, he's switched on, because he'll mention those things. And those are normally things that you would expect a tennis player to do anyway. So you don't normally hear tennis players say it. But for him, it's something new. Like to say, I'm eating properly, I'm going to bed properly, I'm getting enough sleep. I'm resting properly, I'm training properly, I'm working on specific things. And then to come out and also say, I want to win Grand Slams, I think I can win a slam. We never saw that from him before. And I think it's definitely a step in the right direction. I've said it a lot on my channel that whether he wins one or not, we shall see. But I wouldn't be surprised if he makes another final, if he makes multiple semi-finals, because he's got that mentality, I think, to progress. And part of the make or break could be those moments, as you say, Josh, where he throws away a point, a couple of points, or a tiebreaker, as we've seen in the this year, at the start of the year, especially threw away a lot of tiebreakers. Arguably threw away the tiebreaker against Djokovic in the Wimbledon final as well. So if he's able to just make those tweaks, which is easier said than done, then who knows? But with the big three, Federer's retired, and now Djokovic is. I don't think Djokovic is really declining. We'll talk about him in a second. But with Nadal, I think he is waning. I'm a massive Nadal fan, but you can't deny that he's having physical issues. Then it opens up the door for the rest, and it's just whoever takes it, I guess. And he's mature enough now. He's had those experiences, as Brian said, to push on. And I think the sport's better for him being in it anyways. But a little bit of a tangent there on the big three about Federer and Kyrgios. But I had to ask you because he's such a complicated character mentally. And as you say, we don't know him personally, but from what we can see, there's so many different layers to him that I'm always intrigued to get people's opinions, and thought you guys would be perfect to ask about. But I guess in the second of the big three, in Nadal, I mentioned him, but his journey was completely different in the sense that he's the only lefty, I guess, and he was righty at the start, but his uncle told him, no, you're going to play lefty because it's going to give you an advantage. But I guess his biggest hurdles have not necessarily even been opponents, but it's been the injuries. And to continually bounce back from not just the physical scarring tissue or the mental scarring tissue of continually getting injured must take a lot of mental capacity and strength, right? Surely, to continually bounce back and then to continually win then when you're coming back. Because a lot of people say, and rightly so, that he hasn't been, for example, world number one as long as Djokovic or Federer. But then you have to also cater in the fact that's because he's not played as much tennis, because he has been injured for large parts of pretty much most seasons. So the fact that he's managed to somehow take a lead in the Grand Slam race, and that's not to say that he'll stay there, but the fact that he's there is an incredible accomplishment in itself, because no one expected him to win the Australian Open this year, but came back, played. Last match he played was Roland Garros, and then came back and played the Melbourne Somerset, which, I mean, in all fairness and all respect to the players there, wasn't the best of tournaments, but it was there at the Australian Open. He played Maxime Cressy in the final round, didn't look particularly good. So he played 1 week of tennis since Roland Garros and then went on to win it, which is pretty crazy to say. So I wanted to get your guys' thoughts on how you view him from the mental side as well, and what you think he's had to potentially overcome, and what that might have taken in terms of strength-wise as well.
Well, he's definitely somebody that we have mentioned quite a bit on our podcast. I think we've talked about him in a few different ways, and one of those is certainly resilience, and that's, I think, both longer term and shorter term. Longer term in terms of his career, in terms of constantly, as you said, Faizan, constantly coming back from injuries. I think he's injured just so many different parts of his body. It's almost tough to keep track at this point, but having so many injuries and coming back time and time and time again. I think just about every single year it's been something. So that's more longer term, but also his resilience within a match. I mean, we can think of whether it was that Australian Open final against Medvedev, whether it was a couple of years ago against Thiem at the U.S. Open, where he lost first at 6-love, or just so many other matches. I think we look at his resilience and just that never say die, and his ability to play every point the same way and play every point like it's his last and play every point like the world depends on it. And I think a big part of that, and we can talk more about this, is what he does in between points, how he resets. And I think part of that is, maybe some of his superstitions or his particular rituals, and I think most tennis fans know what I'm referring to here. But how he spends time in between points seems to help set him up for the next one. Seems to help him reset, put whatever happened in that last point behind him. As we know, tennis is a sport where you're going to win a lot of points, you're going to lose a lot of points. You have to constantly be able to put points behind you and be ready for whatever comes next. And he seems to do that, I would say, better than anybody. So I think the resilience piece is huge, and that in between point time is, a big reason why he's been so successful as well.
And picking up on that, I mean, I think that in between point time, like Josh said, has helped him be really set up for the next point. But how did the other player feel that? You'll hear other players really talk about how difficult that is, because no lead is ever safe in a game. And there's this sort of relentless approach that Nadal has. And it's frankly difficult to win points off the guy the way he plays. And so it's a lot of work to play someone like that, not just physically, but mentally. So I think about that as well. It's just like he's as invested in each point as I think a professional player can be, or any player can be. And that's difficult to deal with. He has overcome a lot of injuries. And I think, Faizan, this goes back to our intrinsic motivation comment. He just has a deep love of the sport, and he's just not ready to give it up. And it's helped him to get through all that. He often will use the word suffering as a means of not only within a tennis match, but of course across the career, just as Josh said, the resilience piece. And, the ability to suffer well, to suffer for a reason. And it's just part of the nature of the game, but it also teaches you a lot about life and how to deal with things that, adversity that comes up. So I think he's almost like an exemplar of a lot of the things that we talk about in terms of being a mentally tough tennis player. I want to come back to one point that you were making earlier, Faizan, which again applies to all three of them. We had David Sammel on our podcast. So he's Liam Brody's coach. And he talked about a concept that he calls locker room power. And he has a great book about that concept, Building the Mind of an Athlete. And when you look, and so locker room power is basically this aura that great players have. And it really exists at every level. But if you think about the top three guys, they have had this aura for quite a while. And what does that aura do? When you play someone who has that aura, then you buy into their locker room power, you actually are a little bit slower. You are giving away certain points that if you were playing somebody else, you'd probably cover that shot quite easily. But if it's, it's Novak, yeah, that's just Novak. And I feel like when we look at Kyrgios potentially winning a Grand Slam, and Djokovic and Nadal are going to be probably in fewer and fewer of these finals, getting over the locker room power and having the self-belief to beat other people is probably going to be easier for these guys as we go along. I think we've seen a little bit of break in their locker room power, but it's still very daunting, as we saw with Casper Ruud at Roland Garros, to go up against these guys in very difficult finals and really believe that you can win. To me, that's been the big barrier with Team Zverev, Tsitsipas, is that they just didn't believe enough that they were better than these guys. And they just gave them a little bit too much power, and that was enough to lose. So I think that's another thing that Nadal has, certainly has it on clay. It's this locker room power that the guy is practically unbeatable in Paris.
Yeah, I agreed. It's definitely when you talk about locker room power, and I guess the aura and all three have it, as you said. But I can talk about Nadal because I feel like there's more examples of players specifically talking about, especially on clay. And the one example recently is, in the Roland Garros final, which is Casper Ruud saying, I'm so glad, so happy to be on the other side of the net from Rafa Nadal, my hero. And afterwards, it was almost like he was just happy to be there. He was happy to take part. It wasn't necessarily, oh, you know what, I really want to win this. And in that moment, okay, yeah, he's a competitor, he's my hero, but I want to make sure I'm beating him. It was, I'm so happy and privileged to be here. And that was, I think it's not just, the aura intimidation that I think they give, but a lot of players, they will play them and they are their idols. And I feel like that does play on their mind. And from a mental aspect, they're almost in fanboy mode. Oh my God, I'm playing against this person, right? I can't believe it, rather than actually focusing on the task at hand. And that's really interesting. And, it's because they played for so many years that we have that. Whereas, maybe it doesn't happen as much normally in sport to a degree as well. So that's interesting. But Nadal, as he said, has those rituals where, he will do the high jumps at the net and try to he'll run to the baseline in a specific little swerve and pattern, and as you said, has that almost interesting ritual where he cleans the line and sorts out his bandana and his wedgie as well, which is I always find quite amusing. But it obviously helps. It obviously helps because it is him restarting his process, and it almost is him playing the match 1 point at a time almost by doing that, because it is a reset potentially. I feel so it's really interesting, and his is one, as you say, battling through injuries, and yes, he's almost been sandwiched in between because he had Federer to chase and had that rivalry, and that's why he was so upset when he retired. But then he did have Djokovic, who, even though only a year younger, started later and then was catching up, and he saw him in the rearview mirror, and so he's been the chaser, but he's also being chased as well at the same time. And so he's had that interesting conundrum, whereas the other two, they were either at the top or bottom. He's had both. He's kind of felt both, which is quite interesting as well. But on Djokovic, I mean, Brian, you were mentioning that it's a very interesting outlook that he has, that he is happy, and maybe it's ingrained in him, given that he, out of the three, is the only one not to come from a privileged background. He has come from a poorer background. He does have that fighter, kind of street mentality of, I'm going to get what's mine. I need to work hard for it. I will chase and do what needs to be done. What do you guys think of Novak? Because a lot of people see him as potentially even the most mentally tough and mentally strong out of the three, because of just how well he's been able to close the gap, I mean, incredibly on those two. And a lot of people said he's not going to get anywhere near, but he has just been, I mean, he's been the standout player of the 2010s, he was for sure. And so far this decade, I think, you could arguably say he has been as well. Well, he has been because he won 3 slams last year. But what's your views on Novak and how his mental psyche is?
Well, I think he's another one who's at a journey. Because he started after Nadal in terms of reaching top level, but he was perhaps a little bit soft at the beginning. And if you remember, Andy Roddick would call him out for defaulting or retiring from matches. And I think perhaps there was a moment where Novak decided he had to take some things more seriously, like his diet. He's talked a lot about that. And since he's taken things to another level of professionalism, he's been one of the hardest players to beat on the tour, really, beginning with his first Australian Open. So, I think at first he maybe had to grow up or just be a little bit more professional about what he was doing. But he clearly had the skill level to compete at that top level. I think a lot of people will look at Novak and say, well, he doesn't really have any weaknesses in his game. He is very mentally tough. And I think we have talked about Novak in terms of the way he plays his game. Federer has a lot of clarity in how he plays. Novak does too. And Novak is extremely good at playing the high percentage shot nearly all of the time. If he's supposed to go cross court, he almost always goes cross court or down the middle. If he can step into a ball, then he knows he has the ability to change direction. He's not hitting down the line shots from behind the baseline or outside the alley. He's always finding a big fat part of the court, forcing the opponent to have to deal with another ball. And there are times, of course, when he gets into that I'm not going to miss mode. Then that's super hard to deal with. That's one of the base levels of pressure you can put on someone, is by showing them that you are never going to miss. And then that puts somebody into a trap of, okay, what am I going to do about that? And usually players will up their risk factor, then they'll make more errors. And so, again, a lot of clarity about how he plays the game and not letting score and opponent necessarily drive that. And then he's made his game better in parts around what he does. So, for example, his inside-out forehand wasn't always great, but now it's a real feature and has been for a long time. But if you look at even his ground strokes in 07 and 08, they don't look the same as they do now. They look very different, more so than the other two guys. The other two guys have made improvements in their game, but Novak really, I think, retooled a lot of stuff, including his serve, his ground strokes, and how he plays the game. Just much smarter now. Is he the mentally toughest of the three? I don't know. I think they're all great at certain aspects of it. I would put maybe him and Nadal closer to the top, and then Federer just one rung below. Djokovic at times will have some outbursts, but that doesn't usually happen in the big matches. And what Djokovic does really well, and he's talked about this in several platforms, is his use of visualization or really mental rehearsal before matches, in which he sees himself in different situations and then coming through in those situations. And that's something that I think all tennis players can really gain from that type of practice is, see yourself maybe down 15-40 or down a break in a set, and how you want to respond to that. That way, when you're out there, it's not so much like, oh, what's going wrong? What do I need to do? It's like, all right, I've prepared for this. I know exactly what to do. And I think when Novak has a really big match, he does that extremely well, and he's pretty unflappable in those big occasions.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that I would definitely echo some of that. I think what's interesting about Novak's journey is he won the 2008 Australian Open, but then there was a long period of time, I think right around 3 years before he won another one, before he, got to that point again where he won another slam, and he was number 3 for a while. He was constantly that third player behind Federer and Nadal. It seems like, and he wrote a book about it, he got to a certain point where he made a lot of changes. He made changes in his diet. He went gluten-free. I think he went pretty close to vegan or vegan or vegetarian, but he went very clean with his diet, and he does a lot of stretching. As you said, Brian, he does a lot of mental training in terms of visualization and that sort of thing. I know he's very particular, about the water that he drinks. And so I think when I think about him and his journey and what has helped him get to the top is his commitment to his performance in a lot of ways. And I think he's done that in a unique way that has, and even things with his vision recently, wearing a certain type of glasses. He seems to always be looking for how he can get that edge. Maybe we'll keep the vaccine situation, we'll keep that to the side for now. I don't know if that's necessarily useful to get into that, but no, I think that's a big part of it. And I also, when it relates to the mental side, I think what separates him is he has this ability that I've never seen before with any other player to just not miss. He gets in this mode, and he's not always able to get into it, but he seems to get into it when he really needs to, especially when he's down, where he can just limit his unforced errors in a really incredible way, and pretty much not miss. And we've seen it against Federer, against some other guys, where he has really turned matches around. I mean, we've seen recently this year where there's been some matches where he's been a set down, 2 sets down, turned it around. In major semifinals and finals where it's happened as well. So I think, like Nadal in a certain way, in terms of that resilience, he's had a lot of comebacks, and I think his self-belief and I think visualization certainly plays a part in that, and his just consistency have been able to push him through in those sorts of moments.
Yeah, I agree with both. Yeah, the vaccine talk is, we can put it to one side, but I guess that again shows maybe his mental strength to just stick to his guns, right? I guess you can say, which is he's very, very clear in what he wants and how he wants things to be done, and that comes across on the tennis court. And he is, in my view, he's the best at causing forced errors for the opponent because of just how deep he hits the ball. He hits the ball deeper than anyone else, I think, on tour. And it's crazy because a lot of people, I feel like if you're a really casual fan and you watch a Djokovic match, you might not necessarily think this is the best player on tour right now, just because he doesn't necessarily hit huge off the forehand and massive aces, and he's not hitting incredible return winners all the time. There's not that kind of maybe crash bang wallop type of tennis that he plays. Whereas you might see we'll mention Del Potro earlier, but Del Potro or Wawrinka, for example, in their heyday, where they were hitting winners left, right, and center, right? They're ridiculous types of shots. And as Brian was saying, he won't go down the line from behind the baseline. He will know what works for him, what's going to be able to get him into a position to then step in and then finish off the point if need be. But he is arguably as well, in my view, potentially one of the most complete players ever, and could be the most complete out of the three now, just because of how he's evolved from not just his ground strokes, as Brian was saying, and the forehand really was like how Andy Murray's used to be, which was just like a rallying tool to force errors. But now he can hit winners off that. He can dictate, and the reason why he's happy to go into it is because, as good as his backhand is, he's still able to find that short angle on the into-out forehand, which is incredible, despite how good his backhand is. And the backhand is arguably the best two-hander on tour. Maybe Alexander Zverev has something to say about that, or Sinner, but I think it's still the best. And the serve, I was talking to an analyst about it, and they were saying to me that he's year by year almost how he's changed it, and it's now just become so efficient. There's barely any moving parts. It's so compact. And the groupings on his toss are incredible as well. He's able to change direction incredibly. When I watched him at the Laver Cup against TFO, he destroyed TFO. And I'm sure you guys are cheering on TFO being American. But TFO didn't play badly. He really didn't. He didn't play badly at all. He's obviously come off the US Open, played really well. But he just got absolutely annihilated in straight sets. It wasn't even a competition. And I think TFO, the points that he was having to win, he was having to go into deep rallies and then hit incredible, say, passing shots to the net, where Djokovic, hadn't done anything wrong, but TFO had just managed to pull out something incredible out of the bag. And he ended up celebrating after a net cord winning a point off a net cord, because he was just so, I think, frustrated with how well Novak was playing. And he's just clinical. He's precision personified, I feel, Novak Djokovic. And in that sense, you can probably tell I've watched him recently, but I was really, really impressed with watching him. And the only thing I actually wanted to ask on the mental side actually as well from Novak is he's a mental giant for sure. And I feel like up until maybe recently, this hasn't been an issue, but it has happened a couple of times with the crowd. And it happened, of course, at Roland Garros this year, when after he said, 95% of the crowd was with Nadal, and Medvedev has had similar comments, and I guess he's maybe maybe not deserving as much to complain about it, because he's won a slam. So he was complaining about it being for Nadal, but Nadal has won so many slams. I don't know what he was expecting. But for Djokovic, I guess they're going to cheer for Nadal because it's Roland Garros. But he's mentioned it a few times, and I saw also at the Laver Cup he was telling the crowd to get behind him. And in the past, you've never really seen that, because he's almost been happy to be the villain and prove people wrong, and that's given him the drive and hunger. But I almost feel like he's got to that stage where he wants the respect and the juice to say, no, I want people to cheer for me. And that's why when he broke down in tears at the US Open last year in the final when he lost, it was because the crowd was cheering him on, right? Because I almost felt like that was the moment where he thought, oh, I love this. And he got a taste of it. And now he wants more of it. And now when the crowd goes back to not cheering him on, or cheering, predominantly for the opponent, he almost feels like there's like it's almost like a dagger in the heart, almost his respect and honor, and you can tell it does affect him. Well, I think it does anyway. But I wanted to get your guys' view on what you see from that as well. Do you think it does have an effect on him at all?
I think he has talked about how it does, and I think he's even talked about in his mind when the crowd is chanting, Roger or Rafa, he changes it to Novak as a way of dealing with it, right? Getting them to do that. But I think it's also natural for tennis crowds to see someone who's been on the tour so long and then start to back them, especially when they're not playing Rafa or Roger. I mean, let's be honest, those two came first. And it's almost like the tennis world went into this binary universe of you're either a Roger fan or a Rafa fan. And there wasn't room for anybody else for several years. And then, Novak started to get some fans, but it's always been a little bit of a smaller group. They're out there, but it was really hard, I think, to break into that big two at the time. And there's such a following for Roger and Rafa. And I think because a lot of their style was very, they contrast with each other. We've got the attacking player in Federer and the great defender in Nadal. And so Novak was sort of almost like a third wheel in there. And so I think it's been harder for him to break through in terms of getting crowd support. But now that he's, more or less an elder statesman of the game and probably going to have fewer matchups with Nadal, I think he will get more of that adulation from the crowd. And I think he will appreciate it. As you said, Faizan, last year at the US Open, it was really meaningful for him. I would expect that he'll get more of that. And I think every player loves that when they get that kind of support. There's a lot of energy that you can really channel into your performance. I think this is also why guys love playing Davis Cup, just because it creates a whole different atmosphere and energy for the players. I think there's a certain amount of that in Laver Cup now with the Europe versus Team World. So I don't know how you feel, Josh, but I feel like it does play a part in how he plays or what he thinks, and I think he'll get more of it as we go along.
Yeah, I do think he seems to crave it recently. I mean, maybe it's he always has, and maybe he's always wanted that same sort of adulation that Nadal and Federer have gotten. But he seems to have also thrived from being booed at times or not getting that support, because he seems to motivate himself, and he even seems to use maybe if he's playing those Nadal and Federer, seems to use that to his advantage. And I think Medvedev, it's interesting that you brought him up, because I think he's been similar, where he's almost put himself in that position to be a villain, sort of, from his own actions to a certain extent, whistling, giving the sarcastic thumbs up, or whatever, picking fights a little bit. I remember at the US Open, that was definitely an example where that happened. But sometimes I think he'll hear the crowd and he'll sort of egg them on when things aren't going well for him, when he's frustrated. And it does seem to help in a certain way. I remember after the Australian Open, him making comments sort of that he was not losing the fun of the game, but sort of thinking back to that time when he started playing. I remember that press conference that he made where he was sort of talking about this boy who started playing tennis and everything. But no, I think both of them are able to channel that, whether it's the boos or the, less applause. But and I think someone like Kyrgios as well, can do it. It's a matter of, whether all of them would prefer having a little bit more support at times. And, and I think many other players would probably struggle playing under those types of conditions, but they actually have all seemed to manage it pretty well.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think he said something along the lines of he's lost a little bit of the love for the sport, I think, because of how the crowd treated him. But I thought it was in the nicest way possible. I thought it was a little bit naive from Medvedev to expect the crowd to be behind him because he was facing Nadal at the time. And I think it's because he just won a slam at the US Open. It was almost like he expected then, everyone to be cheering him on. And I think he probably should have realized and understood that doesn't matter. He was playing against someone who'd won 20 slams at the time. Everyone was going to cheer him on. That he would have had some fans, of course, but to expect, maybe a 50-50 split crowd, it wasn't going to happen. So it was sad to hear his comments after, and hopefully he understands that. I haven't heard much more from him since. So hopefully he's come to that realization, understanding. It's interesting because he played Novak recently, right? And then he played really well, had to retire because of injury. But I also think, I don't know how bad the injury was, but part of me thinks if it was a Novak or Roger or Rafa, would they have just tried to carry on? And we saw Rafa against Taylor Fritz barely being able to push past the 100-mile-per-hour mark on his serve, carried on, obviously pulled out of the Kyrgios match beforehand in the semi-final. But the fact that he was, if he'd won the second set, of course, he would have been fine. But I think he lost the second set, had a match point, if I'm not mistaken, and then didn't want to carry on. And I could be wrong. Maybe it was just a really, really, really bad strain, and he literally couldn't carry on. And if he had, then I think he said after he could have been out for 6 months. So I don't want to assume too much, but a part of me does almost kind of, the skeptical side of me thinks, but if it was one of those three, would they have done the same? And I'm not too sure. And Novak looked really disappointed as well, which is the true sign of a competitor that, like Nadal at Roland Garros, they don't want to win like that. They don't want to win when someone's having to retire, because they want to win in the right way, I guess. It's probably a little bit of an anticlimax as well, having to win by retirement for those guys because they're so used to winning in spectacular fashion. On I guess then the stars now and the coming through and the big three, starting to slowly phase out. We can talk about on the women's side first, actually, Iga Swiatek, because you mentioned, Brian, as well, that Iga Swiatek's one of the pioneers, especially on the women's side, in terms of herself and a psychologist who everyone is now coming to know better. But she's talked about it a lot, about having a psychologist in her team and how it's helped elevate her game. And she's really taken her game to the next level, especially since Ash Barty retired and there was that vacuum and you almost feel like she's the one that's occupied it. A lot of people thought it might be a few girls, but she's really just said, no, I'm going to be the one to do it. You're going to have to kind of catch me if you can. How impressive have you been with Iga, and how much of an effect do you think it's had? Because she's talked about it a lot in depth, but how beneficial do you think it's been for her? Because I know she's talked as well that, I think I could be mistaken. I think she does also have ADHD, I think it is. So she said that she struggles sometimes to concentrate on specific things, and the psychologist really helped calm and focus and center her, so she's able to focus on things in the right way. So that was really interesting to hear as well. But yeah, I wanted to get your thoughts on her and her mentality as well to the game.
Yeah, I mean, I think her rise over these past couple of years, and I think specifically since Ash Barty retired, how she really has just dominated. I think she actually has twice as many points currently as the number 2 player, but has really been remarkable. And I think that her dedication to the mental game has been a big part of it. I think it just shows that, she really, her and Daria really seem connected at the hip. I mean, they go to all the tournaments together. I know they train on the mental game. I know in a number of different ways. It'd be interesting, really, to hear more from them about what are some of those areas. But I know self-belief is a big part of it. I know just breathing is a big part of it. I know there's actually something that they use called Focus Calm, which helps with sort of controlling your mental state. And yeah, I think she is really an example of how that focus can really that focus on the mental game can really pay dividends. And I think we've seen it with her. I mean, even as recently as the U.S. Open, where she was down, I think 4-2 in the third set against Sabalenka, was able to turn it around, played a tight match with Jabeur after in the final, and seems to be able to bring out her best stuff in those big moments. I mean, I think going into Ostrava, she had something like 10 finals in a row that she had won. So she seems to be able to handle the pressure well and bring out some of her best tennis in the biggest moments.
One of the things I liked from her 2020 French Open win, or some of the things that she said after that, was how working with Daria has really just made her a smarter person. So I think that's often the role of a mental coach with a player is, not only you're teaching them mental skills, but you're also trying to help them develop better perspectives on life that can help you deal with adversity and any difficulties that come up. And one of the perspectives that they were using, especially at that time, was something they borrowed from the U.S. Skier, Michaela Schifrin, which was to keep your expectations low, but your standards high. And so not going out into the court expecting wins, but can you stay as professional as possible with what you can control? Can you have a high level of excellence on those very little things like breathing, your body language, what you're doing between points, what you're looking at, all those little things? If you can have a high standard of excellence, very likely you give yourself a better chance to win. And that really translated in that Roland Garros win in the fall of 2020. And I think that process has only continued. And from reading about the work that they do, this talking, almost like this life skill coaching, it goes on, and there are always different themes that they're working on that are helping Iga in the moment to help her deal with whatever the next phase of her competitive career is. And so the fact that they've got this long-standing relationship is, I think, part of the secret to their success. That they're so well connected, and Iga has that trust for what Daria is talking to her about. Yeah, she is becoming smarter. She's gaining a lot of wisdom just by having that exposure to a sports psychology professional or a mental coach.
Yeah, that's fair. For sure. I think, she's very exciting, Iga, and as you guys have said, the mental coach, and I think the help that she's had, and maybe her drive now and her clarity of thinking has definitely helped drive her towards the success she's had. So that's been incredible to see, especially this year. And she's taken the pressure of being world number one on her shoulders really well. And that kind of leads me on nicely onto the last person I want to discuss, who is Carlos Alcaraz, who's recently become world number one after winning the US Open. And some people might have expected him to win it. I don't think he was the favorite going into it, though. And as you say, Kyrgios at one point was the favorite when the quarterfinal stage was there. And only, I think, maybe going into this from the semifinals onwards, he was. And didn't have to face, a Djokovic or a Nadal in the final, which would have helped, but still an incredible run nonetheless. He became world number one, and his first tournament, in Nur Sultan, he went out and you're thinking, okay, first of all, supposed to face Holger Rune, difficult match, but still expect him to win. Holger Rune pulls out, and he plays David Goffin, and David Goffin beats him in straight sets. The first time that he's been beaten in straight sets this year, but the first tournament he's gone into as the world number one. So I wanted to get some quick thoughts on Carlos Alcaraz and what your guys' thoughts are on him.
We did an episode on Carlos back right after he won Madrid. And because I think both Josh and I saw something different from him that we hadn't seen from some of the other younger players, which was this self-belief that he could beat Nadal, beat Djokovic. So he had to go through Nadal, Djokovic, and then Zverev to win that tournament. And I think he showed something that he actually believed he could do that. Then right after that, he didn't seem to have as much success. The rest of the summer wasn't quite as good, and maybe even came into the U.S. Open. I don't know. I don't know if we really knew where he was at that point, right? But then he managed to get his game together and obviously win the tournament. Now he's number one, and I think you bring up a good point. Like, all right, now you're number one. How do you handle that? And I think one thing that Juan Carlos Ferrero has done really well with Carlos, first of all, he's been through a lot of that journey personally. And I think, as we said earlier, sometimes there are experiences that a player needs to have in order to move forward. So maybe this is something that Carlos needed to have, is to play this match with the weight of being number one and just not be so good at it. Because then you learn from that experience. Okay, what got in the way? And you learn from what got in the way, and then you try to make a change. So I'm not really worried about him. I think it's just, all right, you went out, you played a bad match, didn't handle being number one in the world, maybe, and this is what happens. So I'm not really worried, but is that why it happened? Maybe, maybe not. We don't know, but it wouldn't be unusual for somebody not to handle their first match out as the world number one particularly well.
Yeah, for sure. Josh, what are your thoughts on it? It was also interesting to see him play the Davis Cup a few days later. Literally, I think it was 4 days after he'd won the US Open. He lost to Felix in straight sets. And then obviously in Nur Sultan as well. So he didn't really have any break. Yeah, Josh, what are your thoughts on Alcaraz as well?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about that dip that can happen after, whether it's a gold medal, after it, you win a big tournament, and obviously him winning his first Grand Slam and becoming number one. And we did see that dip. We saw it at Davis Cup, right? And then obviously hard conditions going from one continent to another and having to play right after that, all those emotions and the physical toll of playing a Grand Slam and 7 matches, and he had multiple 5-setters. So yeah, certainly a lot to handle, but I think he will bounce back from both the defeat at Davis Cup and this recent defeat to David Goffin, because he does seem to, even if we think back to earlier this season, right, when he beat Nadal Djokovic, when he really seemed to be making a move to the top. I think at one point, even going into the French Open, he was the favorite. And then he had a few months where, yes, he was playing well. He had some good wins, but he wasn't at that dominant level. And maybe, as Brian was talking about earlier, maybe that's a necessary experience, right? It's not just like, okay, he's getting to the top of the game without any sort of ups and downs. There's always going to be those ups and downs. And I think this is sort of a logical down that takes place after this huge milestone that he's achieved, and just so quickly too. I believe he was outside the top 30 when the year started. So the fact that he's number one now and has reached a Grand Slam, has won a Grand Slam at age 19 is huge. And I think, it'll be interesting to see what he does this offseason. Last offseason, I remember, he really dedicated himself to his strength and conditioning and came back physically looking a lot different, put on a lot of muscle. So it'll be interesting to see if how he dedicates himself this offseason. Is it to the serve? Is it to the decision making, right? Maybe at times he goes for shots that are a little bit more low percentage and he's able to pull it off because of his abilities. But is that an area that he focuses on? I'm sure him and Juan Carlos will be doing some serious work this offseason. It'll be interesting to see what area they focus on.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I was talking to Gil Gross about this actually, and my advice as a non-professional coach was to work on the serve and also his backhand slice as well, because I feel like his defensively from his backhand side, there were some red flags after playing against Zverev at Roland Garros and then Sinner, and he clearly had an issue with playing against people with elite backhands. Musetti he lost to as well, and he was struggling to deal with people who had incredible backhands and got caught in those exchanges. Obviously got over that hump a little bit against Sinner at the US Open because he either went line first and he went hard line first as well and stepped in, or he opened up on the forehand and he moved really well. So I thought he managed to get out of that, but that's been an improvement. But I think generally something that he could improve on is the serve, definitely to get 3 points, and then also the backhand slice as well. So hopefully he can continue to improve, and I'm sure they'll be working on that. But looking forward to it.
Yeah, and I think just like we were talking about the big three and how they all improved over the years, certainly Carlos Alcaraz will do the same. And I think he's in good hands. And one thing that we've talked about on our show with respect to Alcaraz and some of the other top players is the whole team dynamic and the interpersonal relationships and how important that is to top performance with Nadal and Alcaraz and Djokovic to a pretty good extent. There's been a lot of stability in those performance teams. And that's really, really important and something to keep in mind for all players is make sure that your coach-athlete relationship is really good. Have great professionals around you. And make sure that people you can trust. And I think that's what we see with really all the top players, a lot of stability there. And I think Carlos is in a great situation because he's worked with Juan Carlos for a long time, and Juan Carlos has wanted to work with him and, made the choice to work with Carlos. And so I think that's only going to pay dividends for him in the long run.
Yeah, agreed. I think they seem like they have a very, very good bond and understanding. So can only put them in good stead. Actually, lastly, if you guys don't mind, is I wanted to ask about, now that Alcaraz has obviously won the US Open and he is that next gen, as a lot of people like to say. But the next gen, which are now the present generation, really, in the Tsitsipas's and the Zverevs. What do you think, and why do you think those guys haven't won a slam yet? Because there were a lot of people that would have expected, say, Zverev to. I think a lot of people expected Zverev to do maybe what Alcaraz did at his age and then go on. He didn't manage to quite do that. Tsitsipas obviously has made a Grand Slam final as well. Last year was 2 sets love up against Djokovic, didn't convert, hasn't pushed on maybe as some people would have thought. Medvedev has, in all fairness, he's won a Grand Slam, he's won and won. So yes, he hasn't dominated, by winning multiple Grand Slams, but he's got himself into two Grand Slam finals and then won one, if I'm not mistaken, or it might have even been 3. So in saying that, Tsitsipas and Zverev are kind of a little bit behind, and surely they'll be a little bit envious of what Alcaraz has done now. So why do you think they haven't been able to take that next step? Has it been in some sort of mental block, or what's your guys' opinion on that? I guess I say that generation, but really we're talking about Tsitsipas and Zverev, I guess, specifically.
Well, I think a big part of it, I wouldn't say necessarily a mental block, but I think, as you mentioned, Faizan, they've had opportunities, right? That they've each been in at least one Grand Slam final, and they've had opportunities, right? With Tsitsipas being ahead against Djokovic, and that, when we think about Zverev, we think about the Zverev team final from 2020 at the US Open, and that match was very tight. I think both of them felt the nerves. Both of them seemed to be playing pretty tight, weren't going for their shots in the same way that we're used to. I think with Zverev, his second serve, especially when maybe he's nervous or tense, can become more of a liability. So, they've each had those opportunities, but haven't managed to bring out their best game. I think also with Tsitsipas, his backhand, I think can be more of a liability. I think if we compare it to other top players, I don't think his backhand is as reliable, as solid. I think his forehand is excellent, up there, maybe the best in the world or up there with the best in the world. But I think and you two may disagree. But no, I think it really is their handling of those big moments. And I think as tennis fans, actually, we've been in a certain way spoiled by how well the big three have handled those big moments, have handled those Grand Slam finals, have handled those really high pressure moments, and have been able to bring out their best tennis. And, I think that 2020 US Open final was an example of how most people would handle a moment like that, how most people handle a really high pressure moment like a Grand Slam final. And, for both of them, Thiem and Zverev, that was their chance to win their first, which of course Thiem did. But I think, for both of them, it really is with those opportunities that they've had. And, again, they've been few and far between for them and for everybody else these past, couple decades because of the dominance of the big three. Just how well are they able to handle those moments?
I think I'll go back to something I said earlier, which was self-belief. I really don't think they had that sort of elite level, almost arrogant self-belief that they could win those matches against. Now, granted, they were playing, or had the prospect of playing Federer, Nadal, Djokovic at younger ages, and they were still making those finals. And when we look at elements of mental toughness, especially at the elite level, the top three items are self-belief, like a very strong belief that there's something about your game that makes you better than other players. Confidence, really an intense trust of your abilities, especially under pressure, and then your ability to be fully focused. I think it really comes down to that first one. I don't believe that they believed enough. And when you look at how they performed in those matches, even Casper Ruud's not in our conversation, but look how he played in Roland Garros, as you said, kind of a fanboy way of doing it. Medvedev's first final against Nadal, I don't know that he really believed he could win that match. So I think that's been more the issue, and that they have to work on that level of belief and perhaps going out onto the court believing they're better than these guys. And I don't think they have. I think they have succumbed to the locker room power of the big three. That Thiem Zverev US Open final, now there's pressure because, hey, we're not playing Federer, Nadal, or Djokovic. I might actually win this. And the fifth set of that match, especially the end of it, was really bad. Just terrible tennis. The moment was getting to both of them. So, but that didn't happen to those other guys, right? We didn't see that with Federer, Nadal, Djokovic in their first Grand Slam finals and when they had chances to win. Nadal played Mariano Puerta in his first Grand Slam final, and certainly the favorite in that match, but he came through and won that. And so, for me, it's all about that self-belief piece and whether they have it. And that's what I see in Alcaraz, that he has it more than those guys. So if Alcaraz were to play one of them in a Grand Slam final, I think Alcaraz would be. I would favor him in that matchup.
Yeah, agreed. I think with Alcaraz, you make a really good point, and I guess we can say, I think with Zverev less so because he was facing Thiem. Maybe they were under a different type of pressure because I think both of them were towards the top end of the game and people were expecting them to win a slam at that point. So maybe they had the added pressure of people were expecting me to win it. With Alcaraz, I think people were expecting him to win a slam. Maybe not now, though. Maybe next year, but it was coming. And the fact that he played Casper Ruud, I guess you can say, well, he didn't have to play a Djokovic or Nadal. But what I will say about that final is both players, and Casper Ruud wasn't playing his first Grand Slam final, granted, but both players came out and played without nerves and didn't play tight at all from the first point. And that was what was really impressive and was great to watch as just a fan. And I was commentating on the match and I was just thinking, this is great. This is great to see because you don't normally see someone in their first Grand Slam final for a while anyway, because, obviously Nadal and Federer and Djokovic played it a while back, their first Slam finals now. But it might take them a couple of points, might take them a game. Some players, it even takes them a set, or more. But with Alcaraz, it wasn't. It was from point one, just carry on from where I left off. And that was incredible. And considering how many matches he'd played beforehand and how long he'd been on court, it was an incredible level of maturity I think he shows at such a young age. I think that's why people are excited about him, not just the fact that he's arguably the most well-rounded 19-year-old that I've seen. Doesn't necessarily mean he's the best 19-year-old I've seen, but he's the most well-rounded one. On top of that is his ability to play with freedom. And that's why I was asking you guys about the world number one status, is because I wonder whether that only time will tell, put an added pressure on him. And now that he's won a slam as well, we've seen it with, on the women's side, a much more extreme example at Raducanu, for example. Of course, everyone here in the UK, she's been a massive fixture of the news since last year. And, she won her first Grand Slam. No one expected it, qualified, no pressure whatsoever. After that, pressure mounts and it becomes a lot harder because she has the added pressure of people expecting her to win. She can't play with the freedom maybe that she once didn't go under the radar. So they're two similar examples in a way, but also very different in other ways. So it's always interesting to see the younger players come through and how they handle it. And I'm sure, I don't know about you guys, but my dad will say, our generation was different. We're very, we're good go-getters and do it. And, with what my generation, it's, we're maybe not as, we're not as steely and determined as maybe we could be. But, I think on the elite level, sports level anyway, we are seeing that, which is great to see people coming through it and just showing how important the mental side is. So, thanks both for that. Is there anything you guys want to touch on before we wrap it up?
No, this was a fun conversation, Faizan. Really appreciate you asking us to be on, and it's really good to catch up on the current affairs in tennis and what we're all seeing from these top players. So it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, absolutely. No, this has been great. Sorry that had a little bit of technical difficulties with my camera, so I had to sort of switch to my backup, which is a little darker. So sorry about that. But no, this has been great to have this conversation and to discuss, all these, current players, recently retired legend in Federer, and to be on the other side of things. Brian and I, put out episodes pretty much weekly, and have a lot of discussions between the two of us, have some interviews, and it's interesting being on the other side of things. So no, I've really appreciated this. Thank you.
No, thanks for both for being on. It's been really enjoyable to get your guys' views on things, and definitely able to give a level of insight that I can't when it comes to certain topics, especially given the mental side of things. And I know you guys are a lot more practiced in those areas, so I really appreciate you guys giving me a bit of your time. But yeah, do check out the Tennis IQ podcast, which I'm assuming is just on all podcast platforms, all good podcast platforms anyway, all the good ones. So do check them out, and make sure you follow them and leave them a rating and review as well. And there's some very interesting discussions on there. And if you're new to this, then please do hit the like button, subscribe if you watch on YouTube, leave a rating or review if you're listening or watching on a podcast platform. We appreciate it, and we'll see you on the next video. Thank you very much, guys. Thank you, Brian and Josh, as well.
Thank you.